Thanks, Andrew, for sitting down. I guess, and we just heard of the Pastelogram project too, and it seems like a lot of your work involves these sort of long, extended periods of research. And so and this is obviously a multi-year looking into Bonnie and Clyde. And I guess take us through where the initial idea for getting into this real life historical incident that's also achieved kind of a mythic, kind of worldwide mythic kind of appeal and over the generations since, and when did you start looking into it, and what was kind of the process through the research?
I think it was about 2 years ago I started reading about Bonnie and Clyde. The thing that kind of struck me first was this sort of the folkloric presence that their story has taken on over time through pop culture. And so I started thinking about them. I think the real seed was how a lot of couples sort of identify in the sort of us against the world kind of outlook. You know, it's not the hard scrabble life that they had that people identify with, it's the more romantic side. So I think that was what was kind of attractive to me, is that Bonnie and Clyde sort of become an archetype for this sort of outlaw couple. And so that was kind of what eventually started me down the path of thinking of other archetypes. And one of the original kind of mythic archetypes is Adam and Eve and the fall of man. So that's that association and layering those two stories on top of each other sort of built on the more didactic work that preceded this. The more, it's everything I do is sort of research based, but the work that preceded this was much more, it wasn't pedagogic, but it's sort of, I think it was confusing to some people because it had a very historic and whether it was art history or humankind history, it was really getting into sort of arcane phenomena and looking at that, and I kind of just go with what I'm curious about. But I wanted to go further with this work. And really, as Lisa mentioned, working with the Art Foundation, it was working with Lucia Simek and Ryder Richards, and then Josh Good was with us until the beginning of this year. And I think working with those guys just, it pushed me to sort of opened up my thinking a lot. It's almost like school again, a little bit, it's like when you're in an environment like that, and it's, when have been curating shows, and the email threads, like going back and looking at them, are just, it's kind of amazing, like all the thought that's like swirling around these different ideas and stuff. And so that's really sort of pushed me to think in different ways about my work and approaching it. So
in terms of the actual research, I mean, you travel to some of the sites and that kind of thing. I mean, do you have kind of a systematic way you work through it? You begin kind of reading and then you want to go to places, and how does that kind of inform where the work eventually comes out of that process?
What precedes everything is lists. So I'll make lists, and then I'll narrow those lists down and make another list based on those things that I narrowed it down. And so that's not exactly the way I choose the overall topic, but that's how I start thinking about components of each project. And that way I sort of, it's a little more systematic. And I did travel to Gibson, Louisiana, which is where Bonnie and Clyde were killed. And that's the marker here.
It's like a rubbing of it?
It's a charcoal rubbing.
Okay.
I did a few of them to end up with this one. And the background is actually the site where they were killed in Gibson, Louisiana. There's a rise. It's sort of a bend and then a long straight shoot, and there was this rise where the gunmen were hidden. And they had one of Bonnie and Clyde's cohorts' father had a truck, and they were driving to his farm, and the lawmen turned him and had his truck like sitting in the road with the tire off the truck, and that's why they stopped at that site. But it didn't really have a presence for me there, but it was really interesting just to know that what happened there at one time. On top of that, though, there were some other people that sort of pulled up behind us. It was a couple and another guy, and they looked kind of scary, and the whole time I'm thinking they're gonna steal my camera and but it's just everyone's excited about this sort of historical couple, and people come from. There's an ambush museum in the city proper, which is really just a street, and it's the son of one of the law officers that killed Bonnie and Clyde, Hinton. I'm sorry, So the other sites that I went to were Primm, Nevada, the beginning of this year, to photograph the death car.
Oh, it's in Nevada? It's in Nevada now?
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
My wife has to go to Las Vegas every year for a conference, and so we went up a little early, and I got to go visit the car. And not being a smoker myself, it was kind of a shock to it was so dense with cigarette smoke.
Where the car is?
Yeah,
it's like in a museum, or you can?
No, it's
outside?
in a casino.
Okay.
And so there's the sound effects going the whole time, and there's actually it's surrounded by a plexiglass wall, but there's bars and about 2 feet of space, and that's the photograph on the bottom of the symbol key was the one shot that could get the car through those bars without glare of all the slot machines and stuff.
Well, it's interesting that you talked about Adam and Eve and bringing in various religious imagery, and then talking about these places as being kind of almost pilgrimage sites, and kind of conflating those two things in the outlaw image. I know the Clyde Barrow's grave over in West Dallas I've been to a few times, and when I go, there's like a Jameson bottle and half-smoked cigarettes and all sorts of kind of little pilgrims leaving their little, and then there's a sharp contrast there with the car then being not in a place of any kind of, a casino being not exactly where, I don't know, it just seems a strange kind of contrasting image. But is this kind of, is that entering into your thinking a little bit about how these places become magnetic for people who buy into or identify with the myth of the people involved, Bonnie and Clyde in this case?
To be honest, I hadn't made that association, but I love it. I think for me, it kind of becomes that. It's there is definitely a spiritual component to this, and I think some of it's just my own questioning as just a human, about spiritual concerns, and a lot of the titles and stuff are kind of tongue-in-cheek references to biblical and other spiritual ideas. The canvases are titled "And God Made the Heavens" because I felt like the collection of dots, which are the bullet holes from the death car.
Does that mimic the arrangement in the death car?
Yeah, it's all the bullet holes from the driver's side.
Yeah.
They kind of seem like a constellation to me. It just seemed like this nice circle that kind of happens with that.
It's like those Burroughs shotgun paintings.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly. This sort of, there's sort of a violence, and then there's also sort of a calm too. They sort of are opposite poles that happen around that, which I think is really interesting. And I've been told that the show is kind of not indicative of the life of Bonnie and Clyde. It's much more meditative. But I'm looking at it through a historical lens, and I'm seeing it, in my own environment in a very calm serene place, comparatively. So I think, and it becomes like these intellectual layers on top of historical distance. So I really don't have like the first person, second person, or you're remotely related to the topic, other than just as a historical curiosity for me, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not answering your question, but
No,
I think there's the spiritual part is really interesting, and I like the idea of sort of presenting layered. Everything is sort of layered. So the hand pointing down is taken from a historical photograph. A law officer is pointing to the ambush site. This is the day of when they've killed them. They're photographing the site and stuff, and this guy's pointing, but it just seems so reminiscent of the hand of God, judging, and all those like wonderful frescoes and mosaics in Italy, but it's called the mark, and I think I like that he was pointing. No, that was called the hand, excuse me, and the one below is the mark. So together they're kind of judging. So the mark, obviously, the mark of the beast.
Okay.
And so it's sort of tying into that a little bit too. But I also like this idea of question, or just leaving it sort of open-ended. Like these are sort of, it's killing people, robbing, like these are obviously frowned upon. They're not good things for society, but it's not just this flat story. There's a lot of reasons why they were kind of went that direction, even though it still doesn't make it right. It's like there were a lot of, for instance, Clyde grew up in Oak Cliff, very poor, and he was robbing and stuff, but he was also working. But when he would work, the officers would come pick him up for lineups and hold him, just because he was in that crowd. So he couldn't hold down a job anymore,
Right.
because people who wants to hire someone or retain someone who's like constantly being called off by the
Harassed by the
cops.
police, yeah.
So I mean, I'm not justifying what he did,
Right.
but it's like there's more to it.
What's always interesting about the violence is that this whole story unfolds during the Depression, and then it becomes kind of the first kind of media-generated kind of anti-hero celebrity kind of reality TV type thing, because of the way this story became so magnetic for the entire country, following them as their travails through this part of the country. And that's interesting how it plays into the fact that what we're actually talking about are violent criminals, but there's always this kind of a mass appeal that really perpetuates to today, that there's that romance, that there's a relationship there between the romance and the violence.
Definitely, and I don't think that without that element, and they were not masterminds, they were kind of small-time crooks, really. They stole from like little country stores, and they would rob National Guard armories to get guns and stuff, and steal cars, but they weren't like they weren't Dillinger, but it was because there was this couple that there was like this really romantic element, and I think without that, we wouldn't be talking about them, I don't think, and certainly they wouldn't be like emulated by like Jay-Z and Beyonce and Serge Gainsbourg and Bridget Bardot or Hollywood, or whatever. We wouldn't be having that conversation. So
I want to go back to your lists. When you say you begin by making lists and kind of gathering things, what are on those lists? What are the types of things that you're kind of, is it an ordering, a sorting, or creating hierarchies of what interests you, or how are you working through that? What are you putting down?
Well, once I have a subject, and for example, with this body of work, I would be reading and just make notes and stuff of potential directions to go. And really, when I sit down and make the list for the works in the show, I just write down everything I can think of and sort of narrow it down after that. When I went to Maryland Institute College of Art for just a semester of mobility. And one of my friends took this class, and I love this because I wasn't even in the class, but I benefited from it. So they had to write like 100 lists of potential projects that they could do, and then they had to choose one of those things and write 50 more. I was like, man, that's amazing. But it really like has helped me. I found that it's really difficult to work from a deficit. If I have an excess of materials, then it's a lot easier for me to edit, and a lot easier for me to have a pool of things to draw from. It's a much happier way for me to work.
I think right before we came up here, you mentioned that there are rocks in the show that you gathered from. How much of this material is actually gathered from sites that you visited and kind of bringing the actual material from the area into the gallery? What's here that is that kind of approach to dealing with the subject?
There's a few things. There's some rocks on the back of this wall. That was what Josh had asked me about. And those rocks and some of the grasses are from Texas country back roads that I just picked up driving in the country. And there's also some grasses there from the ambush site. The rocks and the weights holding the wall up are also from roads.
In the sandbag type
in the
things?
sandbags,
Okay.
yeah. There's something kind of fun to me about it. It's like Easter eggs, it's like little things that you find around the show. But even to go further with that, some of the things used in the show are charcoal, ash. That's a lot of the drawing materials, and they sort of relate back to the biblical, the content is sort of in the materials a little bit as well, which I think is kind of, that's just fun for me to sort of, it's like, I don't know, it's just a game, I think. And soap, the Dove bar is a rubbing of a bar of soap.
Why soap?
Had the dove on it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Which has a couple of references, obviously, the Holy Dove, but Dove Road is actually where public opinion shifted for Bonnie and Clyde, because that's when they killed a couple of police officers, and one of them was I think he was getting married the next day.
Oh, wow.
So that was where public sentiment really shifted. But I also like the idea of the bad child who had soap in their mouth as punishment.
Well, one other little detail is your name in the apple, and it seems to suggest to kind of let your kind of autobiography kind of enter into this in any way. How much is that to be read into that, there's one piece that has you kind of front and center, even though your name does have some other connotations? It
does. Well, I started with Clyde's saxophone case is next to it, to Bonnie's typewriter cover, and she wrote poems. But the typewriter cover is actually from Marcel Duchamp's Underwood typewriter cover, the ready-made. So that's a drawing of the ready-made with Magritte's apple from the listening room, which is a painting that's, there's an image of it in the symbol key.
Okay.
But I like, there's these two components, but it also is sort of the proto-computer, the apple. I don't know, it's just, I just enjoy having some fun, thinking of all the layers of references in the work. As far as using my name, I think it's just, I think it's funny. I mean,
just lots of little puns and unintended references and things kind of weaving through the whole.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that is one thing in the show.
Well, it gets into the installation, which I kind of wanted to hear you talk about a little bit, because the music isn't playing now, but that really kind of sets a mood and a tone and kind of is a unifying factor. And there's a lot of kind of disparate elements and disparate materials. You mentioned the ash and the charcoal, but then you have kind of ephemera, and then you have the canvas work, and and then this wall, and how you just kind of talk a little bit about what your thoughts were kind of taking now that you had various elements that came out of this research and kind of arranging them into the installation.
Well, I'll start with the music. It's all either me playing guitar or different things and just sort of working with it in the computer. And I sampled some solo saxophone stuff as a reference to Clyde playing saxophone. And I also sampled Moonglow was the #1 Billboard chart hit of 1934, which is when they were killed.
Okay.
So there's a little sample of that in the music. But I was really just referencing, or picking up the mood from like Eno's music for airports and Angelo Badalamenti. So that, I find that music and sound is like just really like indelibly links to visuals. So to have sort of a soundtrack for the show, it seems, I've been playing with that for a while. The Pastelogram piece has a music piece that I composed for that, that's trumpets and drums and field recordings. But, well, and that's sort of building off. I played music since I was 15. So I was in like punk bands and stuff, and it kind of evolved over a long period of time, and I stopped making art for a while just to work on music. And at the end of that was really working with a laptop and just chopping things up and programming and stuff. But it's been quite a while since I was doing that as like trying to make something of that, because I really felt like I could do things with art on my own that I couldn't do with music. I think going through school was very intense, and I also like can see now that I was kind of burned out after completing that, and so I think that was maybe a reaction to that, taking a break and working on music for a while. But it's fed into what I do now. So. What was the other
Well,
part
it
of
sets
the-
a mood, I mean, for the experience, and going back, I guess, to that kind of mournful interpretation, which isn't the way the Bonnie and Clyde myth has been kind of in its various iterations. You mentioned Gainsbourg. There's kind of almost this defiant, celebratory nature to it. This is very much more kind of, a low-key, kind of remorseful, and the music kind of plays into that, I guess. Is that kind of the intent when you start talking about Eno and Badalamenti and how that creates a way to approach the work, that there's a relation there between what you're seeing and what you're hearing?
Well, I do think that there's a relation, but I don't know if I necessarily see it as remorseful, but it's interesting that you do. I guess I feel it's more, I don't know, it sort of, for me, conjures just like alone in the night kind of, I don't know, I picture that moment in Twin Peaks where it's just the stoplight and there's like no one on the street. Like that's kind of what it conjures for me.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily good or bad, it's just like this moment, but I don't know, I think it's really amazing how something so ephemeral can conjure images the way that music does. So there's been artwork that I've been working on that I cannot see it without thinking of the music that I was listening to when I was working on it, and it becomes intrinsically linked for me. But also, there are moments in the music that I feel are lighter, and I feel like I'm kind of like releasing them a little bit,
And then I guess kind of talk through the idea of how you arrange this, particularly with this wall and the backdrop, and what were you trying to kind of accomplish with, I mean, now that you have the materials that come out of the research, how do you going about thinking about them as kind of a cohesive kind of show?
Well, as far as the installation itself, the way that it was installed, I really wanted to build on the white box. I'm not really trying to completely disrupt it, but just sort of acknowledge that it is. It's kind of, sort of born out of the New York school, these guys working in lofts in Manhattan. But before that, it was all the commercial galleries were modeled after French parlors. So it's, I don't know, I can't help but think about like where it is, where the work is seen, because the architecture and where you see the work does impact how the work feels to me. So I at least want to like make a nod to that and acknowledge that I'm aware of that importance, So it's, a floating wall and that you can see the back of. It sort of almost takes on this theatrical quality for me, and with backgrounds and, there's pieces floating. It's sort of becomes something else a little bit. Hopefully something kind of self-aware. I really wish that I'd had this space to work out the show, and it might have been a different show if I had. I don't have like a proper studio at the moment, so I work in pieces. So the backdrop was, one thing, and I sort of work out ideas in the computer, so I'll photograph it and like layer things in Photoshop and work through ideas that way. But it's so different, like coming to the space and hanging the show. One thing with this work was I felt very vulnerable, because I felt like I was pushing myself much more than I had with previous work. The work before was, I think, really tight, and that was really important. And I think it kind of fed back into the content of the work, which is very tight. But opening myself up to sort of more expressionistic tangents with this show was, I felt vulnerable in a different way. And I think intellectually, the more open I am to failure or success, the more opportunity for growth. But the actual like on the ground experiences, I felt a lot of fear. Like I don't know. I just doing something different is really challenging for me emotionally. So I was really second guessing myself as I was installing the show and kind of seeing it come together. But I think that in the end, I have done the best work that I could at this moment in time. I feel good about what I've done, even though I'm not. I think that I won't really know until some more time has passed how I really feel about it.
Well, a lot of your other stuff is dealing with various bookmaking and that kind of thing. And was there a deliberate desire not to tackle this material in the same way?
Yeah, the work that preceded this was folios and boxes and books and things that fit in these. It's all like very sort of this modular thing, and I think every body of work is sort of a response to the last one, and it has to be for me. And I think I do sort of err toward revolution versus evolution as far as working methods are concerned, and that probably works against me in a lot of ways, especially commercially. But it's sort of what I feel I have to do as an artist, is push myself as hard as I can to sort of grow and expand and go into new areas. So yeah, I think not making really tight work, and also I felt like the show that preceded this and the Twain show, the Art Foundation show, where everything was labeled very museologically, I was like, I'm not going to do any labels in the show at all, and just see what happens and have a show list that sort of is, the key that unlocks all the titles, and just plan everything out so it works in that way. Well, I think anyone sort of working in any field, you sort of see what works and what doesn't, and you try to go beyond that next time. So that's kind of what I'm doing.